We are thrilled today to have Dr. Julia Twigg presenting a seminar on age and the lens of dress, intersections of time, embodiment and culture. We ask that you keep yourself on mute during the presentation to avoid background noise. Julia will present for about 45 minutes and we'll leave the last 15 or so minutes for a question and answer session. Please feel free to type your questions into the chat box at any time during the presentation, and we'll read them out on your behalf during the question and answer session. Or during the question and answer session, you can just simply unmute yourself and ask Dr. Twigg directly during that time. So, Dr. Twigg is an Emeritus Professor of Social Policy and Sociology at the University of Kent, Canterbury, UK. She has written widely on age and embodiment, recently focusing on the role of dress in the material constitution of age, publishing Fashion and Age, Dress, the Body, and Later Life, a well-known recent book. Her earlier work centered on bodywork and care, publishing Bathing, the Body in Community Care, and the Body in Health and Social Care some years ago. She's actively engaged in debates around cultural gerontology, critical gerontology, and has co-edited with Wendy Martin the Routledge Handbook of Cultural Gerontology. Her outstanding work is widely cited internationally, and she's been the recipient of numerous prizes. She's one of the world leaders in the turn to critical cultural gerontology that's occurred since the 1990s. And more recently, she's a world leader of the turn towards new materialists, post-humanist theory in social gerontology. Julia has made an outstanding contribution, I think, to all of our book collections. Thank you. We will now virtually welcome Julia to the session.
Thank you, Gavin. Thank you very much for that very nice introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to this discussion very much. I'm sorry, in a way, it's such a distant way of engaging this remotely in this kind of way, and I hope that in the question and answers we can have a bit more of direct contact, and I look forward to that very much. So let's get going. My broad aim today is to suggest that dress provides a lens through which we can explore the nature of old age or later years. Superficially, I think dress can seem a somewhat frivolous topic, but I want to argue that it forms a central part of the presentation of self in everyday life. It's inescapable, it's ordinary, it's part of the lives of older people, as it is indeed all people. So dress forms the vestimentary envelope that lies between the body and its social presentation. It's a central aspect of how individuals are interpreted and judged. Dress is central to social categorization and constitution. Now, we're familiar with that in the context of wider sociological analyses from the time, indeed, of classic theorists like Simmel and Veblen. But until recently, old age has not been seen as part of these approaches. It barely exists as a topic within dress studies, which tends to focus anyway on the youthful, the fashionable, the transgressive. And older people are certainly not seen as part of that. So age as a dimension of difference, sort of analysis, is missing from dress studies, as it's largely been missing from cultural studies more widely, which is related to dress studies quite closely. And I might add at this point that age is also missing from some of the other related and key debates, for example, on intersectionality, which tends to focus on other dimensions of discrimination and difference, and to leave age somewhat on the sidelines. Perhaps we might like to take that up in the discussion. But in a similar way, dress has been excluded from age studies. Social gerontologists tend to focus on old age through the lens of frailty and decline. Important topics, of course, but not the whole thing that there is to be said. In this context, I think dress is often perceived as a frothy, marginal topic, fun to write about, but not really significant. Now, I want to disrupt those kind of assumptions and suggest instead that dress has much to tell us about later years. Indeed, it addresses a number of key questions. For example, it can help us think about the interplay between bodily and cultural aging. How much of what we understand of old age is physiological and bodily, and how much is social and cultural? And what's the complex interaction between these two? Or the status of age as a social identity, the degree to which we're perceived, ordered, judged by our position in an age hierarchy, in the ways this does or does not give meaning and shape to our lives. I'd argue that dress is indeed one of the ways in which age identity is expressed, so that a study of its constitution allows us to explore the changing ways in which age is perceived itself. A focus on dress also allows us to explore the role of material culture, in this case clothing, in supporting or undercutting identity, enabling us to perform or resist age in different ways. As such, it relates, as we shall see, to the wider reconstitution of age in the thesis, the idea that the nature and experience of later years has undergone a shift in the last 50 years, particularly under the impact of consumption culture, and that with this, a new discursive space has opened up, that of the third age. Dress also allows us to explore the moral regulation of age, the ways in which older bodies are policed and disciplined in distinctive ways. In particular, it can allow us to unpack the meanings and dangers that attach to dereliction in dress in old age. For such sartorial lapses in the old can signal a more general moral collapse, the threat of descent into pitiable, derelict old age. As a result, it can become important to maintain a certain standard in age, even if one is not to fall outside mainstream society. This symbolic denigration is, of course, not a new phenomenon, but it's acquired additional significance with the emergence of new modes of governmentality in age, new disciplinary requirements linked to the wider bodily perfectionism that increasingly marks the current consumption-mediated world. So I want to argue and suggest that a focus on dress allows us to reposition and refresh our analysis, brings a new lens through which we can capture the everyday experiences of older people. It allows us to focus productively on the embodied, the mundane, and the material. And it allows us to avoid too narrow an emphasis on problematic old age and on those aspects of old age that are of interest to policymakers, as opposed to old age as it's actually lived and experienced by older people of the level of their everyday lives. And in doing so, I think it helps integrate later years into the life course as a whole, undermining that very common tendency to treat old age in isolation, bringing it back into the scope of wider cultural and historical analysis. Now, the work I'm going to talk about today on dress is part of what I think is we can see as a wider intellectual movement that we can term cultural gerontology. 2015, I published with Wendy Martin an edited collection, the Routledge Handbook of Cultural Gerontology, that aimed to pull together these new developments and to reflect this changing landscape of age studies. In particular, I think it tried to show a greater integration with other disciplines and fields of study, and it itself was part of the wider cultural term within the social sciences. I think these developments have refreshed and renewed aging studies, giving it a kind of new vigor and a new sense of interest. But they've also acted back. They've also had the effect of introducing age into other fields of analysis. It's a two-way street, as it were. I think we in aging studies have gained enormously from this new work in the arts and humanities and cultural studies, but also we have been able to act back and bring age out of its kind of isolated marginal status at the end of life, integrate it into these other studies. So it's a gain, I think, on both ways. Over the last decade, I've been engaged in a series of empirical studies of dress and age. I'm not going to go into the details of this, other just than to say that they've focused on older women and the retail industry. I've undertaken a parallel study of older men, looking at gender in this context, And I've also looked at work on the role of dress in the context of dementia. I'm not actually going to talk about that dementia work today, but I wanted to flag it up because to make the point that cultural approaches don't just apply to the third age. I think sometimes we can think, oh, it's all very fine to be talking about these kind of approaches in a third age context, but once we're into the fourth age of frailty, they don't seem to appear. I don't think that's right. I think there are very interesting things that we can say from the perspective of cultural approaches, from materiality and embodiment in relation to the fourth age also, though I'm not actually going to talk about that today. Okay, so let's turn to the main part of what I'm going to talk about. Dress, I think, is one of the means whereby social difference is made manifest and visible. We're familiar with that in relation to gender and class and to those classic writers that I referred to. But it's true also of age. Dress practices encode and reflect age as a social category. One of the ways that we can see this is through the long established phenomena of age ordering in dress. And by age ordering, I mean the systematic pattern of cultural expectations according to an ordered and hierarchically arranged concept of age. And I want to put a bit of emphasis on that word hierarchically, and perhaps we might pick up in debate some of the arguments that Tony Calasanti makes in relation to intersectionality and a hierarchy. So it's a hierarchically arranged concept of age. It's largely expressed negatively. It's about what it's inappropriate to wear as you get old. So it's a negative set of principles. And I'm going to show you an image. It will be familiar to many of you. It's the pyramid of age image. It's been around for many hundred years. And as you see, we move on the left of the image from the little girl as a child, and we follow the trajectory of her life over the arc of the pyramid. And as we see, the clothes she wears as she passes through these classic stages of her life change. So the skirts are short, they're frilly, and you notice in the third one from the left, a young girl, she's got a low neck, she's got feather in her hair, a shortish skirt and frills. But as we move over through the decades, as it were, you notice the hair becomes more prim, the neckline becomes higher, more closely closed in, the skirt becomes longer. So the clothes change as we see her passing through this period. But also, of course, we notice how the body that wears these clothes changes. Because one of the things that these sorts of images tell us is the ways in which aging is both embodied, is both bodily, both physiological and cultural. And I think that's one of the ways we can see this through dress. We can illustrate this through a slightly more modern image. What you're looking at is the fit model in the design studio of Edinburgh Willow Mills, a UK company that specialises in the older market. The figure on the right that you hear, you can see it says ladies size 18. It's the new fit model for the mature figure. Size 18 is quite a large figure, but not out of the way in relation to older women. The fit model you see on the left is actually the old one that they used to use, and as you can see, it doesn't really reflect the changes in the female body with age to the same extent. So the new one is a more successful. Designers, when they're working in this area, learn to adjust the cut to respond to the bodily changes that occur with age. And that's an important part of addressing successfully the mature market. Some of these adjustments are directly to the nature of the body in later years. The way that shoulders move forward, waist thicken, body weight moves to the middle of the body. There's a lessening of weight on the arms and legs. Bust lower, shoulders come forward. But some of these changes that designers make in adjusting the cut, higher necklines, covered up arms, longer skirts, are responses to cultural norms about exposure of the older body, which increasingly becomes in culture an object of distaste, something to be hidden, something perhaps even to be ashamed of. So I think in this, dress norms express a wider process that many older women report, one of becoming invisible, a form of social and cultural erasure through covering up, fading into a form of greyness. And we can set this in a wider cultural context or political context. Barnard, for example, has argued that we should recognise in general how dress is ideological. Part of the processes whereby groups establish, sustain, reproduce relations of dominance and subordination. And most significantly, part of how these relations of power are made to appear natural, proper, legitimate, obvious, unquestioned. Clothes express and naturalize social positions, especially hierarchically arranged ones. Now, that's a kind of analysis that we're relatively familiar to in relation to gender and to class. But isn't it one also that applies to age? Are there not features of age-ordered dress that are ideological, that similarly express and naturalize hierarchically arranged social positions, that suggest subordination? I'm thinking here of the dull, self-effacing, don't look at me dress. Note how it's defined by what it's not. It's not showy, it's not attention-grabbing, bright or glamorous. So one of the ways in which we can interpret the persistent ordering of dress in age is in terms of the operation of a wider ageist cultural code that writes directly into the dress of older people, their marginalisation and exclusion. Here again, I point to the work of Colasanti concerning relations of subordination of power and their significance in terms of age and identity. But surely things have changed. The dominant cultural narrative isn't that of the dominant cultural narrative today is that this ordering has gone, or at least it's drastically weakened. Older people need not no longer tone down or retreat into invisibility in the way they did in the past. And certainly such perceptions are widely current in the media, caught by such phrases as 60 is the new 50 or 40 or something. It's often asserted, for example, in particular, that the baby boomer generation will refuse to don that mantle of age, will continue to wear their jeans and pursue youthful, fashionable styles. Older people are surely part of the mainstream now. And I think this Posey Simmons cartoon captures very well some of the tensions around this argument. So you'll see it's a return to the famous pyramid of age, this time depicted in terms of men, and we're moving through the cycle of age. And as we see, men, superficially, the same clothes across this life course now. So we're all wearing the same thing. We're all wearing T-shirts and shorts. But the bodies that wear them are, as with before, very different. And indeed, when we look at the details of the clothes, we see that those two have been adjusted for the bodies and adjusted in terms of fashionability. If you look at the life cycle, you'll see elastic waists, for example. They appear at the beginning of this life cycle and then they reappear at the end. They're very much a mark of age. So there are subtle adjustments going on in the design of clothes for this age group. Now, there was some evidence in the work that I undertook for this idea of change. Here's the book that looked at the study of women. And it was clear in this that some of the testimonies of older women themselves, from clothing retailers, journalists in the study, that they all felt, or many of them felt, things had indeed changed. Here's a quotation from the design director of George at Asda, a large supermarket in the UK. When I first started working 30 years ago, there was a point of time when people, the majority of people, they'd switch into that way of dressing, into classic dressing. I should tell you that classic dressing is a code word within the fashion industry for older, because they felt that was appropriate for their age. But that's gone. This is a massive change, a huge change in my lifetime. But though there were comments of that sort, I think we need to be also add a note of caution. The study also revealed evidence for the continuity of norms around dress, with respondents emphasising the need to be careful, choosing clothes with caution. Many had faced what I term the changing room moment, in which they had found styles that had once flattered no longer did so. As one woman said, "I'm very sad, I'm very upset. I mean, some of the styles are quite gorgeous and I'd love to be able to wear them. When you're in the changing room and you see, oh goodness, is that me? I just think, no, I can't wear it anymore. It's a lovely style, I just can't wear it. I just feel very sad." and then I've got to look for something that's more appropriate for my age. Now, this debate about cultural change also needs to be set within the wider economic context, because shifts in the dress code are not simply the product of social change, but reflect developments in the production system. The early 21st century saw a massive influx of cheap clothing from the low-cost economies of the East. As a result, clothing became significantly cheaper, fueling an acceleration of the fashion cycle. And this has indeed produced what we can call a true democratization of fashion, in the sense that easily affordable fashion styles are now available, even for those on low budgets. In responding to this expanded production, the fashion industry has actively sought new markets. And the most significant of these have been children and older adults. And here you can see a kind of fashion shoot image very clearly aimed at co-opting this new older market. And this is the period when we see that conscious extension of fashionability to both those groups of older people and children. Now, at an academic level, we can locate these shifts in what we might term the Reconstitution of Aging thesis, which argues that a series of social and cultural and demographic shifts have repositioned older people nearer the mainstream. Oberry and Termstrand and others have suggested a new version of the life course, in which later years are part of an extended and shared plateau of middle life that persists until the disruption that occurs with the arrival of serious ill health. So this long arc of middle years. Such ideas are also reflected in arguments that have been put forward earlier by Gilliard and Higgs about the emergence of third age as a new cultural space. But are the problems with this sort of analysis? Does it emphasis on the third age, vividly presented here, characteristic of much of the work in cultural gerontology, or some of it at least, present what's a sectional analysis? One really that only pertains to sections of the well-off. Is it too much concerned with performance, with agency, with self-fashioning, and not enough with the external structures of exclusion, discrimination, poverty? Such analyses seem sometimes, I think, implicitly to buy into a celebrationist account that underlies consumption culture. Consumption culture sells on dreams and fantasies. Most journalism in relation to fashion is all about this. It's about reflecting back to readers a fantasy version of themselves. It's a distinctive nature of that sort of journalism. And I think there can be a danger of academic analysis becoming complicit in that sort of discursive construction. And the parallels we could draw here with the media treatment of post-feminist empowerment through practices of femininity, including overtly sexualized femininity. So we need to be careful when looking at fashion age not to be drawn into this celebrationist discourse seduced by the media account of change with its systematic biases. We need to recognize also in many ways it's a classed account, but it's also a coupled account, as this picture here rather shows. It presents a dream and fantasy of middle-class coupledom. It's aspirational rather than an account of the reality of older people's lives. The majority of women over 65 in the UK, in fact, live unpartnered. But we also need to recognise that these judgments are rooted in distinctive features of the fashion system. Wait a minute, sorry. No. Lost a bit. Sorry, I'm slightly lost. No, okay, I'm going to jump now. I want now to turn to the second of my two themes, which concerns temporality. And I want to look at this in terms of three intersecting trajectories that have emerged, particularly when discussing the role of dress in the narration of life. The first of those is the trajectory of aging, which is the process, the cultural process of becoming old within a specific culture. It's a process, as it were, of donning the mantle of age, of becoming an older person with the kind of assumptions and expectations that attach to that. So it's social, structural or cultural processes, the prompts, the requirements, the impositions, the external readings of the self and reflections of them that are made by the individual. Together, these make up the sense in which we can talk of being aged by culture in Gillette's terms. But the second trajectory of temporality and time is slightly different. It's the trajectory of historical time, because it's not just that we're young or old, but we're young and old in a particular historical moment. And that can affect some of the interpretations that we make when we look back on the process of being an old person in the past, or when respondents today comment, oh, I'm a granny, but I don't dress in the way my granny dressed. Grannies don't dress like grannies anymore. Some of the problems with that is that you're looking back to a different historical moment. Garments that may appear elderly or middle-aged from current perspective may not have been so. I don't know if any of you have looked at pictures of undergraduates arriving, well, certainly in British universities in the 1950s and 60s, and they're all young men wearing tweed jackets and with ties, and they look immensely middle-aged. But they're not middle-aged. Those are the dress of young men in the 1950s and 60s. They're easygoing, they're loose, they're not formal. So we can misinterpret them by not realizing that we need to look at being young and old within distinctive historical time. So the meaning of things change through time. And the third trajectory is the trajectory of that of our individual lives, in which identities and subjectivities can themselves shift and change. Some people's dress lives are marked by continuity and sameness, and I certainly had that within the studies that I did. But others show radical change that's related to the individual and indeed in some ways related to the historical period. So it's an individual situated within a particular historical time. Now, I'm conscious that we've been concentrating for some time, and I know that Zoom is not the most friendly of experiences. So I thought I'd end really by looking at these issues through the perspective of the life of one particular respondent, one particular person I interviewed, who we're going to call Angela. So here's Angela when I first met her to do an interview when she was living in a slightly rundown coastal town in Kent. She deliberately, she told me afterwards, put on her pink wig to meet me because she wanted something with a bit of dash and something that would sort of start the interview off very well. So here she is being photographed in the kind of clothes she likes to wear, and you can see the kind of influences, ethnic, slightly hippie-ish, tie-dye influences that Angela liked to wear. Here she is when she'd taken the wig off because it was a bit hot later in the interview. And the story she told me was really one of her journey from ultra respectable youth in a secretarial college in South Kensington by an unhappy conventional marriage to a doctor, until then under the influence of feminism, of course, a historically situated turn in particular, a return into higher education, a classic route that we know about, a move to a freer existence until when I met her, she was living a happy life in the rather artistic fringes of a coastal town in Kent. And as she moved through all these changes, her clothes changed. So here we have her in South Kensington. Elegant and confident. So if you look at the picture, the front row, third from the left in the gingham dress, that's Angela, looking very confident, very elegant. And anyone who experienced that period will instantly recognize the backcombed hair, the pinned up hair, the dresses are absolutely characteristic of this period. But although she looks, here she is in the gingham dress, she looks very elegant and confident. That's not at all how she found. I always found it difficult to dress. I've always felt a bit of a lump. I just felt a lump. I didn't feel comfortable in fashionable, elegant clothes. They just weren't me. I did a lot of sports at school. I was good academically. I was also very physical. I wasn't this sort of feminine, little girly sort. I never have been. I'm a bit of a clumper. I stride. I don't sort of totter. I think that repudiation of the kind of surface appearance that we saw in the image and then the explanation of how she felt inside, again, is very characteristic of the lives of many women, that discordance, as it were. here she is, she's the same era as the time she's dressed to go to a dance. Incidentally, when I showed this to some students, they asked me why was she wearing washing up gloves? And I had to explain that those aren't washing up gloves. Those are glacé kid evening gloves for going to a dance. She described really her marriage to the doctor, a not happy marriage at all. He wanted her very much to dress in a way that was appropriate and that suggested their status and wealth. And here's an account of this, what he says. He started saying, I think you should dress up a bit more. And they lived in a very middle-class dormitory, a London dormitory town. Everything shot off, and she describes how they go off and drop their husbands at the station. And I asked what it meant by dressing up. He wanted me to wear something a bit more, that we had lots of money. And then she describes going down to a shop. And he says, look, I think you should buy some smarter clothes. And he chose the things he wanted her to buy out of the things that I thought were acceptable. She never wore them, really. They just went in the cupboard. And I asked what kind of clothes they were. And she described a knitted skirt suit, very swirly. And then the colour, it was beige. Oh, God, beige, navy blue. Those kind of colours. It wasn't a lot of choice. It was a very respectable town, she tells us, and they sell respectable, classic, hear that word, classic clothes. But she escaped from all this through involvement in feminism, through getting further higher education. And here she is in the guise of a more radical feminist, being photographed later in London. But then subsequently she settled with a new partner on the north coast of Kent, where indeed I met her. So we can see how life changes were expressed through forms of dress, changing both historical times and styles, the process of being and becoming old, and she comments on that trajectory, but also that individual trajectory of personal change. So that brings me to my conclusion. I think dress helps us look at the way in which age is embodied, the complex interplay of the physiological and cultural elements in this. It reveals how the social structural aspects of age, forms of exclusion and integration, how these are enacted, performed, and sometimes resisted through day-to-day dress practices. But it also allows us to explore historical and cultural change with new challenges to these identities and enactments resulting from cultural, economic, and demographic shifts. It thus reveals cultural change through time at the level of the changing meanings of later life, that social structural point. It also allows us to look at temporality in terms of the trajectory of individual lives, their narrations and material memories. Dress thus enables us to look at later years in a different way, one that is, I would argue, warmer, more sympathetic to the lives of older people themselves, but at the same time addresses questions of social and economic structure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Julia. That was great. And I know that everybody is now giving you a virtual round of applause.
That's very kind. Thank you very much.
Some others are organising the questions, so I'll just hand over.
Hi, Gavin. Do you want me to respond to something, or
can I ask? Sorry. So I'll start the questioning. Thank you very much. I'm from the anthropology department here. I've been here 10 years, and I actually study paleopathology. So and my area of expertise in particular is vitamin D deficiency, but you get vitamin D from the sunshine, and the amount of sunlight you get exposed to your skin can have an effect on it. And something that's quite often noticed is that older individuals experience more vitamin D deficiency and diseases arising from it. And there's various reasons for that. And of course, part of it's cultural reasons in ideas on dress. And when I talk to students, I often mention this, and that older people, you know, wear cardigans, etc. The type of clothing that you were showing, but I think it could be quite culturally different in different areas of the world, and as you mentioned, possibly through time as well. And I tell them, and here I'm going to reveal my own moral regulation in action. Many years ago, and I was still based in the UK, I went to a conference in Rio de Janeiro, and because of the infrequency of flights, was there a bit early and spent a day by the hotel pool. And I noticed a lady, I was there with a thesis I was reading, across the pool, who didn't appear to be wearing anything on her lower half, which like shocked me to my core. And she had a towel wrapped around her. She was a much older lady. And then I realized she was wearing something. She was wearing a bikini and she had a thong on, which so I'll be completely honest, as a sort of good British person, convent education, etc. It was like utterly shocking to me. But in that, and talking to students later, I realized we can't assume that in past communities, older people would necessarily have covered up more. And to what extent have you noticed that there are very different ideas across different cultures in the world?
Yes, I certainly think there are different ideas, and there's an enormous variety in dress style. So I don't really want to give too unitary an account. I've given a rather unitary account, I acknowledge that. I suppose one of the things I could say, first of all, is that my comments are about British culture now, sort of thing, rather than that they're an attempt at a pan-cultural analysis. I would say, however, I think that in the West, there has been a tradition of older women covering up that's fairly visible. If you look at old pictures like the Pyramid of Age or going back, there is a tendency for a sense that older women's skin and sexuality should not be so overtly visible. But that, of course, does not rule out the possibility of change, nor indeed of the difference that you identified in Rio. And I think cultures of embodiment in Rio and South America are rather different. So I think there are significant differences there. Just answering on the vitamin D issue, that is, as you know, a problem in Britain because of our low sunlight, and certainly for South Asian descent populations and older groups there, with the combination of not much sun and also a tendency to cover up, they are a group that there has been health concern about, particularly.
There's a couple of questions that have come through the chat. Ava asks, has the fact that we exercise more affected what we think is appropriate to wear?
Well, I mean, there's two things I say to that. One is that there's an enormous growth of one of the sources of a new vocabulary of dress has been sport. Enormously influential in the last 30 years has been the coming of athletic, I can never even say how you say it, athletic leisure, essentially clothes that have derived from the sporting regime. So I think that yes, has had a big impact. I suppose it also raises this question of how much are older people drawn into this culture of health, and of a form of embodiment, the disciplining the body, the slimming, the tone, and also using those techniques of toning and things as anti-aging interventions. I see there are people here, I see Bob Marshall is appearing, and there are many people who've written wonderfully on these topics precisely. So I think maybe they should join the conversation now.
Sure, I can join in briefly. It's lovely to see you, Julia. Great talk. I think that's a really interesting question, and it's one that I think, and you kind of touched on this, Julia, in terms of consumer culture around celebrity culture as well, and the kind of presentation of these, exemplary agers, the Helen Mirren in the red bikini being the kind of classic image there, that you only get through constant attention to the body and constant body work. And that becomes, I think, a really lifelong project now to kind of maintain that.
Yes, I agree with you. I love everything you write about this. But I think it is important that we retain a capacity to say, we can look at this as a phenomenon, but we mustn't get drawn into it, as it were. We mustn't become complicit in this, oh, right, everyone's doing this now. This is the new mode of body being. I mean, I think we should be able both to critique it and also recognize that it doesn't reach everyone. There are groups who just have given up and take another cream cake and don't do exercise, and also and or whose lives are so pressed by ill health, by all sorts of circumstances. This is a kind of frothy fantasy.
Colin had a question. So his question was, will the pandemic have a long-term influence on fashion?
Oh gosh, I don't know what to say to that. I mean, we're all sort of trying to think about the future, and will we all be going to work, and will we never need to wear a suit again, and all these kind of things. I don't know. I expect it will, because fashion picks up stuff, but I'm not, I can't predict that.
Perfect. And Wendy says, thank you, Julia. Thinking about Angela, I'm curious about how we see ourselves versus how others see us in terms of narrations and material memories.
Sorry, can you just say the first bit? How we see ourselves
and versus how others see us in terms of narrations and material memories.
Well, there's always an interesting issue about the way in which clothes say things about us. I think we all believe that. We believe that our clothes express something about us. And of course, the kind of culture we live in has probably encouraged us to think that. And dress studies talk about the language of clothes. We're all familiar with that. There is a sort of persistent discrepancy between, if you ask people to say, show them a load of pictures and say things about what does that say about this person, and then you ask the person in the picture to say, there's quite a lot of discrepancy between those two in empirical work. So although we may think that our clothes send messages about us, they're not necessarily always read by other people quite correctly. So I think it's a kind of foggy sort of language between the two.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. I was really struck by the images of Angela from her past and her description of herself, because I wasn't reading in her body in those images that the way that she was describing herself feeling, right? Like she was, especially that first picture with her in the gingham dress, because even the way she's holding her body, the way her legs are crossed so daintily, and even the pictures later on. So that was fascinating to me, thinking about how she described herself as being a clumper when she was younger, yet those images certainly didn't depict that at all. So it just, I don't know, it's just struck me and made me think about what do we do with that when we're asking people to cast back, right? And talk about how they dressed and how they felt in the past versus now, and teasing out different influences, right?
No, I agree with you. I mean, I was taken aback about that. I don't think it's that uncommon. I think a lot of women would say, you know, looking, at the time I thought I looked terrible, but now I look at it and I think, gosh, I look quite pretty or something. And I think it also is evidence of the stamp of the period. Those were all young women who'd been taught how to sit elegantly. I'm trying to do it now, with their legs crossed like that, who'd been taught to sit there. All of them are slightly different versions of that, you know, early 1960s look. So I think the stamp of the period is really very strong. So even if you don't feel you're fulfilling it, somehow you've been corralled into looking like this elegant 1962 person.
Sarah has a question. It says, thank you so much, Julia. I'm wondering if in your research there were any connections made between aging and fat shaming or fat phobia among older people.
I'm not sure I can give a quick answer on that. I'll give a slightly oblique one, but it's not, maybe not quite sort of the best thing, is to say that one of the techniques in all of anti-aging in relation to dress is extreme dieting. It may make you look rather drawn, but what it has the effect of giving you a kind of figure that can fit into a young cut of dress. So a young cut has got a higher weight, a higher bust line, and is slimmer. And so if your aspiration is to look young and fit in young clothes, then you need to get really thin. So it is a kind of anti-aging technique, though it's pretty extreme. Beyond that, I'd have to cast through my thoughts and think about the individuals. Certainly some people talked about having put on weight, and some minded, and some were fairly happy about it, really. Didn't bother them.
Wonderful, thank you. Linda asks, to the extent that we are all becoming more environmentally aware, will an openness to secondhand or thrift buying make a difference to the factors that you've talked about?
Well, I think the whole development of a critique of fashion, which we now know is an incredibly environmentally damaging process, and of course the growth of fast fashion that I talked about, which has been accelerated by extraordinary low-cost fashion of this century, has made it an issue, and has made recycling, wearing old clothes, not just a kind of stylish thing, but also a kind of moral thing. And I imagine we could see those influences occurring among older people just as much. In general, I think there's been a tendency for people for sort of retro dress appealing to young people. It's not so effective as a look, I have to say, when it looks like it's just come from the back of your cupboard and it's been there for 40 years and you're now bringing it back in the cycle. So I don't know, but I think all of us are going to have to face up to the extreme waste involved in the clothing industry.
Alana asks, do you have a favorite photograph or image of an older person from your book?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I have ones I like in the book. Ones that I used, you know, from sort of media, things like that. And I think, like lots of people who work in the age field, I have photographs I like of older people, or pictures, images, paintings, drawings, those sorts of things. But I don't think I have a single one. No, that's an interesting question. No. I can see a little thing popping up from Wendy. Should we respond to that about the dementia issue? Or is it's disappeared now? Chat. Oops.
Yeah, she says for dementia, it becomes more risky to experiment with fashion as we get older, as inappropriate clothing, so bright, thrift, mismatched, can be
yes.
read as a sign of disordered thinking.
Yes, I'm afraid I think that is true. And I think that's the point I was making about the dangers of dereliction in dress, the kind of sartorial lapses that when you're a teenager or 22, you know, ripped jeans, dirty clothes, you know, stylish, and that's all right. There comes a point when people start making judgments about that. I'm afraid so. I remember very vividly, long ago, I was visiting a dementia ward, and a woman came in. She'd obviously been in a very bad state, and she was being admitted, and she still had the signs though of her social background. She was clearly an upper middle class woman from her style, her clothes, hair and things, though very deranged and things like that. She was then processed through the hospital into an acceptable dementia mode, and you know, her hair was put up in a little bun on top, she was neat, and everything had been erased from her. So it was an example of the dangers of appearing derelict, as it were, and what happens to people. But I agree, bright, thrifty, mismatched can take on a dark meaning.
Perfect. And then Laura asks, says, wonderful talk, Julia, and lovely to see you virtually.
That's one of the wonderful things about this. Although I think it's very strange and distant and horrid to look into, you know, it's also lovely to see people.
And she asks, I'm wondering about your thoughts on how changing understandings of gender and the performance of gender will continue to influence later life fashion.
That's a really big and a really interesting question. I think people do carry into, we both carry into our later years changes that have occurred through the trajectory of our lives, but we also respond to the new circumstances. So people aren't just sort of fixated. They're not sort of forever stuck in the 1960s or the 1980s, you know, and just carry on. So it's a kind of interplay of the two. So I think that changes in the gender code that occur, I think, are likely to affect people, even if they were, but I'll give you an example. I interviewed a miner. I mean, I didn't talk about, I've talked about women today, but did a study of men, and a former miner. So a man from a very kind of traditional working class macho culture. And he laughed because he said now he dressed a bit differently. He'd even got some pink shirts, he said. And so, you know, for him, pink shirts had formerly meant the kind of thing that he wouldn't want, but he was quite happy about wearing them. So I think that kind of a greater fluidity and greater freedom, you could say, for men to express themselves had its effect. So I don't see why that shouldn't happen. Yeah.
And Gavin had raised his hand. So Gavin.
Thanks. Yeah, this is a little bit out there, but you know, in the presentation today and in your broader work, you talk about the agency of materials, in this case, dress, and you talk about the co-constitution of materials and age. And what I've been thinking recently, particularly when I read your work, is, are we getting towards very, very gradually a kind of an all-world perspective on aging? That's where we look at the aging of humans, other biological entities, and materials as well. So it's sort of, we're moving towards a Gero of all things. That's kind of a bit out there, but that sometimes when I read the new materialist literature, that kind of seems the logical conclusion where we're heading. And if you look at critical health studies, it's not really out there. Like this whole idea of ecological health, one world health, that's the health of biology, humans and materials and how it's all intertwined. And I don't know if you've thought about that. It's what I'm thinking of at the moment. And I'm reading a lot of your work and it's bringing me towards those ideas.
Well, Gavin, that's very interesting. I haven't, I'm afraid, thought that. So I'm very interested, and you've provoked some new ideas for me. I'm aware of these sort of arguments about this sort of unity, but I hadn't really thought of it in terms of aging, actually. That's an intriguing thought. Thank you. I'll think about that further.
Yeah, I suppose if there's a theory that underpins it all, I suppose it's entropy, right? The way that the universe is gradually falling apart, becoming more disordered, and that includes like us and animals and everything else in it. But I think we will wrap up now. It's been, as I say, a great seminar, great attendance, great questions and discussion afterwards, and I hope that you will tune in next time for our next seminar. We'll provide information on when that is, both the Gilbrea seminars and the HAS talks as well. So thank you very much, everybody, and I'll see you next time.